I'm Jean Kilbourne. As an educator, I was influenced early in my career by a book titled Teaching as a Subversive Activity. Since that time, Dr. Neil Postman, one of America's most important thinkers and social critics, has written broadly and influentially on issues of education, technology, public discourse, and the media. Now, with his latest work, The End of Education, Dr. Postman turns to the current crisis of American schooling. Here he offers us a provocative redefinition of the problem confronting our schools, our teachers, and our students. Revealing the double meaning of his title, Dr. Postman warns that we have lost sight of the purpose or end of education. He first turns to his most central idea, the idea of narrative. A culture's narratives, he explains, are the guiding stories our culture tells about itself, about where we come from, where we are going, and who we are. They are the stories which define our very identity and our sense of purpose as a society and as individuals. In The End of Education, Neil Postman reveals the erosion of traditional American narratives which once purposely defined the meaning of public education. He demonstrates how schooling once made sense within coherent stories having to do with citizenship, opportunity, democracy, and equality. In a brilliant redefinition of the problem now confronting us, Dr. Postman demonstrates how new and markedly different narratives underlie our present conception of school. Here he exposes dangerous new narratives of economic utility, consumership, technology, and separatism. From the internet to multicultural curricula, from advertising in our schools to educational policy, Neil Postman reveals how these new narratives lie at the core of our current thinking about the purpose of learning, and how they threaten the possibility of restoring education in our time. In describing how we might reasonably and creatively respond to these problems, Dr. Postman proposes useful narratives to help schools recover a sense of purpose, tolerance, and respect for learning. The End of Education heralds a new possibility for a redefinition of the purpose of education, the essential first step before we rethink and freshly determine the means. I'm Jean Kilbourne.
Without an end, that is, without a purpose, we will quickly come to the end, that is, the finish of education. And I might add, the sooner the better. In considering how to conduct the schooling of our young, adults have two problems to solve. One of them is an engineering problem, and the other is a metaphysical one. The engineering problem is essentially a technical one. It's the problem of the means by which the young will become learned. It addresses the issues of where and when things will be done, and of course how learning is supposed to occur. The problem is not a simple one. It requires, among other things, some knowledge of applied psychology, group dynamics, the structure of subjects, and of course practical experience. Any self-respecting teacher will have some ideas about how to solve this problem. Nonetheless, it's important to keep in mind that the engineering of learning can be assigned an importance it doesn't always deserve. As an old saying goes, there are 1 in 20 ways to sing tribal lays, and all of them are correct. And so it is, I think, with learning. There is no one who can say that this or that is the best way to know things, to feel things, to see things, to remember things, to apply things, to connect things, and that no other will do as well. In fact, to make such a claim is to trivialize learning, to reduce it to a mechanical skill. Now, of course, there are many learnings that are little else but a mechanical skill, and in such cases, there well may be a best way. But to become a different person because of something you have learned, to appropriate an insight, a concept, a vision, so that your world is altered, now that's a different matter. For that to happen, you need a reason. And this is the metaphysical problem I speak of. A reason, as I use the word here, is different from a motivation. Within the context of schooling, motivation refers to a temporary psychic event in which curiosity is aroused and attention is focused. And I don't mean to disparage it, but it must not be confused with a reason for being in a classroom, for listening to a teacher, for taking an examination, for doing homework, for putting up with school, even if you are not motivated. This kind of reason is somewhat abstract, not always present in one's consciousness, and not at all easy to describe. And yet, for all that, without it, schooling does not work, no matter how ingeniously it is engineered. For school to make sense, the young, their parents, and their teachers must have a God to serve, or even better, several gods. If they have none, school is pointless. Nietzsche's famous remark is relevant here. He said once, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how." And this applies, I think, as much to learning as to living. To put it, as I said it before, there is no surer way to bring an end to schooling than for it to have no end. Now, by a God to serve, I do not necessarily mean the God who is supposed to have created the world and whose moral instructions, as described in sacred books, have given countless people a reason for living, and more to the point, a reason for learning. In the Western world, beginning in the 13th century, and for 500 years afterwards, that God was sufficient justification for the founding of institutions of learning, from grammar schools, where children were taught to read the Bible, to great universities where men were trained to be ministers of God. Even today, there are some schools in the West, and most in the Islamic world, whose central purpose is to serve and celebrate the glory of God. Now, wherever this is the case, there is no school problem. Certainly, there is no school crisis. There may be some disputes over what subjects best promote piety, obedience, and faith. There may be students who are skeptical, even teachers who are non-believers. But at the core of such schools, there is a transcendent spiritual idea that gives purpose and clarity to learning. To such schools, the word God is spelled with a capital G. But there are schools that have been animated by a transcendent spiritual idea which may be called a God with a small g. Now, I know it's risky for me to use this word, even with a small g, because the word having an aura of sacredness is not to be used lightly, and also because it calls to mind a fixed figure or image. But it is the purpose of such figures or images to direct one's mind to an idea, and more to the point, to a story. Not any kind of story, but one that tells of origins and envisions a future. A story that constructs ideals, prescribes rules of conduct, provides a source of authority, and gives a sense of continuity and purpose. A God, in the sense I'm using the word, is the name of a great narrative, one that has sufficient credibility, complexity, and symbolic power, so that it's possible to organize one's life and one's learning around it. Without such a transcendent narrative, life has no meaning. Without meaning, learning has no purpose. Without purpose, schools become houses of detention, not attention. Now, there was a time when America offered its children such narratives, which in effect were answers to the question, what are schools for? There was, for example, the great narrative of democracy, which the American artist Ben Shahn once called the most appealing idea that the world has yet known. Alexis de Tocqueville called it the principle of civic participation. Gunnar Myrdal encapsulated the idea in the phrase, the American Creed, which he judged to be the most explicitly articulated system of general ideals of any country in the West. The first chapter of the story opens with, in the beginning, there was a revolution. As the story unfolds, there arise sacred words, such as government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Because he helped to write the story, Thomas Jefferson, the Moses of the great democracy God, knew what schools were for, to ensure that citizens would know when and how to protect their liberty. This is a man who produced an essay that could have cost him his life, and that included the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Well, it would not have come easily to the mind of such a man, as it does to our political leaders today, that the young should be taught to read exclusively for the purpose of increasing their economic productivity. Jefferson had a more profound God to serve. As did Emma Lazarus, whose poem celebrates another once powerful American narrative. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," she wrote. Where else, save the great narrative of Jesus, can one find a story that so ennobles the huddled masses? Here, America is portrayed as the great melting pot, and such a story answers many profound questions, including, what are schools for? Schools are to fashion Americans out of the wretched refuse of teeming shores. Schools are to provide the lost and lonely with a common attachment to America's history and future, to America's sacred symbols, to its promise of freedom. The schools are, in a word, the affirmative answer to the question, can a coherent, stable, unified culture be created out of people of diverse traditions, languages, and religions? There have been, of course, other narratives that have served to give guidance and inspiration to people, and especially that have helped to give a transcendent purpose to learning. Among them is one that goes by the name of the Protestant ethic. In this narrative, it is claimed that hard work, self-restraint, and a disciplined capacity to delay gratification are the surest path toward earning God's favor, or if not that, of realizing what was once called the American dream, which, by the way, was not simply an economic aspiration, but included internalizing the full range of responsibilities and beliefs that gave America the authority to declare itself a moral light unto the world. Well, it pains me to say it, but I fear that these great American narratives are no longer as powerful as they once were. And why this is so would have to be the subject of an entirely different talk. Here it is important to say that as significant narratives have faded from view, they have been replaced by stories that are thin, crass, and certainly without transcendent meaning. As a consequence, the idea of public schooling is placed in jeopardy. Among the present answers to the question, what are schools for? There is, first of all, the God of economic utility, which tells the young that they are what they do for a living, and that therefore the main purpose of learning is to prepare them for entry into economic life. The idea is to teach the young how to make a living, not how to make a life, which has always seemed to me the point of education as it was to Jefferson, Horace Mann, and John Dewey. Related to the God of economic utility is its unholy son, the God of consumership. In this tale, the young are told that the surest way to earn God's favor is to buy things. It tells them that they are not what they do, but what they own. Its principal commandment is conveyed in the slogan that I've seen on some t-shirts. Whoever dies with the most toys wins. Now this is, of course, a dominant narrative of television, which exposes the young to 600,000 television commercials in the first 20 years of their lives. Apparently, many schools love this God, as evidenced by the fact that 5,000 schools in America now require students, as part of the curriculum, to watch Chris Whittle's TV commercials for Nike, Mars bars, and other delectables. Then, too, there is another God, the great God of technology, which insists that the main purpose of learning is to help the young to accommodate themselves to vast technological change, to become what the technology will make them become. Now, this is a narrative based on the false and somewhat hysterical premise that never before has there been so much technological change as now. For those of you who believe that our own century is unsurpassed in technological innovation, I should like to mention just a few of the inventions of the 19th century. Telegraphy, photography, the rotary press, the telephone, the typewriter, the phonograph, the transatlantic cable, the electric light, radio, movies, the locomotive, rockets, the steamboat, the X-ray, the revolver, and the stethoscope, not to mention canned food, the penny press, the modern magazine, the advertising agency, the modern bureaucracy, and, for God's sakes, even the safety pin. Now, next to this, the information superhighway, email, and virtual reality do not seem to me to be so stunning and disorienting, and it puzzles me why so many intelligent educators have lapsed into a gee whiz mode about technology. For those who believe that modern technology will provide a significant narrative around which learning can be organized, I should like to read to you a short poem written by a teacher in the early 1920s. This is the poem. Mr. Edison says that the radio will supplant the teacher. Already one may learn languages by means of Victrola records. The moving picture will visualize what the radio fails to get across. Teachers will be relegated to the backwoods with fire horses and long-haired women. I like that line. Or perhaps shown in museums. Education will become a matter of pressing the button. Perhaps I can get a position on the switchboard. Well, I don't go as far back as the introduction of the radio and the Victrola, but I am old enough to remember when 16mm film was to be the new god of learning, then closed-circuit television, then 8mm film, then teacher-proof textbooks, now computers. Like the teacher who wrote that poem, I know a false god when I see one. I must also mention here the rise of still another god, which goes by several names, including the god of tribalism and separatism. In its most fervently articulated form, it is known as the god of multiculturalism. Now, before saying anything about it, I should specify that it must not be confused with what once was called cultural pluralism. Cultural pluralism is a 70-year-old educational idea whose purpose is to enlarge and enrich the American creed, specifically to show the young how their tribal identities and narratives fit into a more inclusive and comprehensive American story. If people use the term multiculturalism as a synonym for cultural pluralism, there is, as I see it, no problem. But when the term is used to promote a curriculum of exclusivity or a point of view that stresses above all else love of tribe, implying separateness from, if not hostility to others, then multiculturalism is indeed a dangerous god to serve. The argument is sometimes made that such a multicultural curriculum is justified when an entire student population is African American or Mexican or Puerto Rican, as is often the case in our large cities. Now, this might make sense if it were the task of public schools to create a public of hyphenated Americans. But our students already come to school as hyphenated Americans. The task of the public schools, properly conceived, is to make the hyphens less distinct. The idea of a public school is not to make blacks black, or Koreans Korean, or Italians Italian, but to make Americans. The alternative leads, quite obviously, to the balkanization of public schools, which is to say, their end. This path not only leads to the privatizing of schooling, but to a privatizing of the mind, and it makes the creation of a public mind quite impossible. The theme of schooling would then be divisiveness, not sameness, and would inevitably engender what Arthur Schlesinger Jr. has called the disuniting of America. Now, when I am done here, we'll have some time for questions and comments from the audience, and some of you may want to argue with me about my critiques of the gods of economic utility, consumership, technology, and tribalism. If you wish to do so, I will help you now by making my position as clear as possible. I believe these gods have no transcendent spiritual content. They offer no basis for moral conduct, no rules of community life, no metaphysical integrity, no sense of continuity. Their existence suggests to me a spiritual emptiness in our culture, a sense of confusion about what schools are for and about what they can be for. And this emptiness and confusion are the major problem facing public education in America. Yes, it is true. We need to improve our facilities. We need to pay teachers more. We need to reduce class size, find better ways to assess learning, and as our mayor keeps saying, eliminate an unwieldy and expensive bureaucracy. These are technical problems, and if we have the will, we can solve them. But even if we do, we are still left with the question, what are schools for? If you will allow a metaphor here, we can make the trains run on time, but if they don't go where we want them to go, what's the point? I might add here, since I just made reference to Mayor Giuliani's recent attack on our public schools, that in comparing Catholic schools to the public schools, he neglected to mention the most significant difference between them, that Catholic schools most definitely have a spiritual, transcendent narrative that gives coherence and organization to learning. The public schools do not. Now, because I believe that a culture and its schools must offer children significant gods to serve, I devote a lot of my time to a consideration of where we can find narratives that would give point to public education. Now, this isn't an easy task, in part because public schools do not have the authority to promote a worldview that has no residence in the society at large. Public schools are, after all, state agencies and can invent no gods of their own choosing. Schools are mirrors of social belief, giving back what citizens put in front of them. Now, this is a serious restriction on what gods we may ask students to serve, but it's also an opportunity. At any given time in the symbolic universe of a community, there dwell multiple narratives, multiple stories, some shining at the forefront, vivid and unmistakable, some in the background, indistinct and half forgotten, some sleeping, some recently awakened, and some in uneasy contradiction to others. The task is to choose among them, to find some that hold the promise of being accepted by a community and have the possibility to inspire our young about the necessity and meaning of learning. And I should like to suggest 3 possibilities. The first I call the story of the Spaceship Earth. This is the story of human beings as stewards of the Earth, caretakers of a vulnerable space capsule. It's a relatively new narrative, not fully developed, but filled with excitement for young people. It's a story that evokes in young people a sense of responsibility and commitment. And it is a story that has the power to bind people. The story of the Spaceship Earth makes the idea of racism both irrelevant and ridiculous. And it makes clear the interdependence of human beings and their need for solidarity. If any part of the spaceship is poisoned, then all suffer, which is to say that the extinction of the rainforest is not a Brazilian problem. The pollution of the oceans is not a Miami Beach problem. The depletion of the ozone layer is not an Australian problem. It follows from this, of course, that genocide is not a Bosnian problem, hunger not a Somalian problem, and political oppression not a Chinese problem. Never send to know for whom the bell tolls, John Donne wrote. It tolls for thee. If ever there was a narrative to animate that idea, the Earth as our one and only spaceship is it. Moreover, I need hardly point out that this story of global consciousness does not significantly conflict with any traditional religious beliefs. I am not aware of any deity who would take satisfaction in the destruction of the earth, or for that matter, the disintegration of cities. One can be a Christian, a Muslim, a Taoist, a Jew, or a Buddhist, and yet be imbued with a commitment to the preservation of the planet. In like fashion, the story of the Earth as a spaceship does not conflict with national or tribal tales. It does not require that one reject or even be indifferent to one's national, regional, or tribal loyalties. One can be an American, a Norwegian, a Frenchman, or for that matter, a Lap, and without sacrificing one's tribal identity, can be enlarged by adopting the role of Earth's caretaker. This is an idea whose time has come. It is a story of interdependence and global cooperation, of what is at the core of humanness, a story that depicts waste and indifference as evil, that requires a vision of the future and a commitment to the present. A second possible narrative is one I call the story of the fallen angel. I use a religious metaphor here to emphasize the point that what I shall describe is not merely a method or an epistemology, but a narrative, a story, and one of almost universal acceptance. The story, as it is told in various places and forms, is essentially as follows. If perfection is to be found any place in the universe, it is assumed to exist in God or gods. There may have been a time when human beings were perfect, but at some point, for various reasons, their powers were diminished so that they must live forever in a state of imperfect understanding. Indeed, for us to believe that we are godlike or perfect is among the most serious sins of which we are capable. The Greeks called the sin hubris. The Christians call it pride. Scientists call it dogmatism. The major theme of the story is that human beings make mistakes all the time. It is our nature to make mistakes. We can scarcely let an hour go by without making one. In this talk, I am fairly sure I have already made at least 2 or 3, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have noticed them. That we may be mistaken, and probably are, is the meaning of the fall in the fallen angel. The meaning of angel is that we are capable of correcting our mistakes, provided that we proceed without hubris, pride, or dogmatism, provided that we accept our cosmic status as the error-prone species. Were the story of the fallen angel taken seriously in school, we would have a curriculum that does not see knowledge as a fixed commodity, but as an ongoing struggle to overcome human error. In fact, the curriculum would be the study of error and our heroic efforts to overcome it. Our students would know that their textbooks are filled with errors, that their teachers' minds are filled with errors, that their own beliefs are filled with errors. But they would not be disheartened or shamed, for they would know that in learning, we may correct our errors, and that the worst sin is to immunize ourselves against correction. Such a curriculum would have as its purpose to cure ourselves of the belief in absolute knowledge and to promote the idea that we are dangerous to ourselves and others when we aspire to the knowledge of gods. And now a final suggestion. I call it the story of America as an experiment. Every school, save those ripped asunder by separatist ideology, tries to tell a story about America so that students will feel a sense of national pride. Students deserve that, and their parents expect it. The question is how to do this and yet avoid indifference on the one hand and a psychopathic nationalism on the other. Well, as it happens, there is such a story available to us. It has the virtues of being largely true, of explaining our past, including our mistakes, of inviting participation in the present, and of offering hope for the future. It is a story that does not require the belief that America is superior to all others, only that it is unique, youthful, admirable, and open wide to unfulfilled humane possibilities. No student can ask more of his or her country. No school can offer more. I propose then the story of America as an experiment, a perpetual and fascinating question mark. The story includes the experience of those who lived here before the European invasion and of those Europeans who provided the invaders with both their troubles and their ideas. After all, every story has a prologue. But the story properly begins, as Abraham Lincoln saw it, with a series of stunning and dangerous questions. Is it possible to have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people? And who are the people anyway? And how shall they proceed in governing themselves? And how shall we protect individuals from the power of the people? And why should we do all of this in the first place? Well, the point is that these questions are still unanswered and will always remain so. The American Constitution is not a catechism, but a hypothesis. It is less the law of the land than an expression of the lay of the land, as it has been understood by various people at different times. What is freedom? What are its limits? What is a human being? What are the obligations of citizenship? What is meant by democracy, and so on? The history of America is the history of arguments over these questions. Happily, Americans are neither the only nor the first people to argue these questions, which means we have tried to find answers and may continue to do so in the Analects of Confucius, the Commandments of Moses, the Dialogues of Plato, the Aphorisms of Jesus, the Instructions of the Quran, the Speeches of Milton, the Plays of Shakespeare, the Essays of Voltaire, the Prophecies of Hegel, the Manifestos of Marx, the Sermons of Martin Luther King Jr., and any other source where such questions have been seriously addressed. But which ones are the right answers? We don't know. There's the rub, and the beauty and the value of the story. So we argue and experiment and complain and grieve and rejoice and argue some more without end. Which means that in this story, we need conceal nothing from ourselves. No shame need endure forever. No accomplishment merits excessive pride. All is fluid and subject to change, to better arguments, to the results of future experiments. Now this, it seems to me, is a fine and noble story to offer as a reason for schooling, to provide our youth with the knowledge and will to participate in the great experiment, to teach them how to argue, and to help them discover what questions are worth arguing about, and of course to make sure they know what happens when arguments cease. No one is excluded from the story. Every group has made good arguments and bad ones. All points of view are admissible. The only thing we have to fear is that someone will insist on putting in an exclamation point when we are not yet finished. The Spaceship Earth, the story of human error, America as an experiment, are just three possible narratives. In my book, The End of Education, I've included a couple more, and I've also suggested how we might go about making any one of these the central organizing narrative of school. But at no point in the book or any place else do I claim that these are the best we can come up with. They certainly do not exhaust the possibilities. They exhaust only my own imagination. I do claim, however, that we need to begin and to sustain a conversation about the metaphysical basis of public schooling. And we must, in the end, find narratives that are worthy of such an expensive and time-consuming enterprise. And we will need to find such narratives within the boundaries of our own culture. In any case, this much is clear, at least to me. Without a transcendent and honorable purpose, public schooling in America must come to an end. With such a purpose, public schooling becomes the central institution through which the young may find reasons for continuing to educate themselves. I think the conversations people now are having about education might suggest that there are some possibilities of our overturning or replacing some of the crasser and thinner narratives that now animate school with more serious ones. But it's very hard to say. If you think of any television commercial that you might concoct that would be urging students to stay in school or urging parents to support public schools, what would come to mind as a reason for asking people to do this, say on a mass medium like television? It would be mostly the same thing that the President says and the Secretary of Education and even the Secretary of Labor say, which is stay in school so that you'll get a better job. I mean, that's the story that they give. So that doesn't make one very optimistic.
So you'd be optimistic then in the face of that?
Well, yes. I mean, I did write a book, you know. Why would one write a book on a subject like this if one didn't have some sense of the vitality of Americans to change and to reconsider issues, especially when it comes to education? 100 years from now, if American culture is finished and anthropologists or historians look back to see what we contributed to world culture, there are about 3 or 4 things that come to mind. One of them, of course, is the flush toilet, which I think you shouldn't underestimate. Don't underestimate. But certainly the idea of what we might call mass public education. This is an American idea. Americans have always believed in it. They've always complained about their public schools. They've expected their public schools to be panaceas, but we've always invested in them and believe in them. I don't think we're done with our public schools yet. And I think the movement toward balkanizing the schools, toward privatizing, toward vouchers, and so on, I'm fairly optimistic that that will pass, and that Americans will look to the possibilities of revitalizing their public schools. This is an idea that scholars from many different fields have got interested in, especially psychologists, by the way. Bruner's interest in narrative is in personal psychology. I mean, that each of us is telling himself or herself almost every minute of the day the story of our lives. And it's very important that in this story, you are the hero of your story. Because if you're not the hero of your story, there are names for this. Like paranoia, schizophrenia. So we hope, and as for me, I'm just a blip in your story. That's all I should be. So the psychologists have discovered that this is what people do all the time. They tell themselves stories, narratives. They weave a tale in order to produce meaning. To have meaning, you have to have it in some context. That's what we're calling a narrative here. I've extended the idea in a cultural sense, that cultures need narratives. And I call them gods with a small g, but we don't, if that disturbs you, forget it, just call them narratives. But I mean, that's what we have to try to work. But this is what Václav Havel has been talking when he addressed the United States Congress 3 years ago. He said the biggest problem in the world today, he said he was talking about Eastern Europe because he didn't want to make the congressman too nervous, but he was talking about us. He said the biggest problem is the loss of narrative, that in Eastern Europe, these people had believed in this great story that Lenin and Marx, or Marx and Lenin, had weaved for them. And now, all at once, it seemed, they stopped believing it. Where will they get another story? People without a story are very dangerous, because Hitler's come along, or Mussolini's, or Stalin's, and give them a story, because people can't live without a story. And not all stories are humane. Some of them are extremely dangerous to other people. But they all try to do the same thing. And Hitler's great story, I put great in quotes, of Aryan supremacy, did exactly what a narrative does. It creates ideals. It gives people a purpose. It explains their past. It prophesies the future. The Third Reich was to last for 1,000 years. It lasted for exactly 12 years because it was such a lethal story for those who were not Aryans that it was doomed. So Havel says, well, where will the Russians and the Czechs and the Poles and the Bulgarians, where are they going to get another story? So he said they look to America. They say, give us a story. And what story do we say? Believe in a free market? What the hell kind of story is that? Right? I want to thank you all for coming, and I appreciate it.